A tiny yes today can buy you a bigger yes tomorrow. That is not a slogan. It is a documented finding from behavioral psychology, and it explains a persuasion tactic that shows up constantly in management, sales, and everyday life. Here is where it started. Picture a quiet suburban street, the kind with trimmed lawns and station wagons parked in driveways, ordinary in every way. Nothing about it looked like the site of a landmark study. That is exactly what made it useful. Real neighbors, real doorsteps, no lab coats, no clipboard-waving strangers in a university building, just an ordinary knock on an ordinary door. In 1966, researchers named Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser ran an experiment in a quiet California neighborhood. They wanted to know if a small commitment could change how willing someone was to make a much bigger one later. So they sent a researcher door to door with a tiny request. Would you put a small sign in your window supporting safe driving? That is it. A small card, barely noticeable, propped in a window. Almost everyone asked said yes. It cost nothing. It took 10 seconds. Nobody thought twice about it. Think about what that moment actually looked like from the homeowner's side. A stranger knocks, explains the cause in a sentence or two, holds out a small card, and waits. There is no pressure in the request itself. Nobody was asked to donate money, sign a petition with legal weight, or commit to anything beyond a few square inches of window glass. The ask was calibrated to be almost beneath notice, which is exactly why saying yes felt so effortless. Nobody stood on their porch weighing the decision. They just said sure, took the card, and went back inside. 2 weeks later, a different researcher, someone the homeowners had never met before, came back with a very different request. This time, the ask was big, and it was ugly. Would you let us put a large, poorly lettered sign on your front lawn? The sign was oversized. It blocked the view of the house. It was the kind of request most homeowners would reject on site. Try to picture that sign the way a homeowner would have seen it, propped against a mental image of their own front yard. Big block letters, crooked, clearly not the work of a professional sign painter, planted right in the grass, visible to every car that passed and every neighbor walking a dog. This was not a tasteful, discreet nod to a cause. It was the visual opposite of the small window card, loud where the first ask had been quiet, ugly where the first ask had been harmless. On paper, there was no reason anyone should have said yes to it. And that is exactly what happened. For one group, homeowners approached cold, with no prior contact, mostly refused. But the homeowners who had agreed to the small window sign 2 weeks earlier behaved completely differently. They said yes to the big, ugly lawn sign far more often than the group asked cold. The direction of that effect was not subtle. It was consistent enough that Friedman and Fraser gave it a name that has stuck in psychology textbooks ever since: the foot in the door technique. What makes the finding hold up, decades later, is how clean the comparison was. Same neighborhood, same rough demographics, same ugly sign, same pitch from the second researcher. The only variable that changed was whether a person had already said yes to something small 2 weeks earlier. That is about as close to a controlled experiment as you can run on a real street with real front lawns, and the gap between the two groups was too large to explain away as chance. Why does a 10-second favor change behavior 2 weeks later? The answer lies in something psychologists call self-perception theory, and it is worth sitting with, because it is not really about persuasion tactics, it is about identity. When someone agrees to a small request, they do not just perform an action. They collect a tiny piece of evidence about themselves. I put up a sign supporting safe driving. What kind of person does that? The answer forms almost instantly, mostly outside conscious awareness. I am the kind of person who supports this cause. I am someone who helps when asked. That self-image is subtle, but it is sticky. It does not vanish the moment the small favor is done. It sits there, quietly reshaping how the next request gets processed. This is a strange feature of human psychology when you actually stop to examine it. We assume we form opinions first, and then act on them. Self-perception theory says the process often runs the other direction. We watch our own behavior the way we would watch a stranger's, and we draw conclusions about who we are from what we did. especially when the reason behind the original action was mild enough that no single obvious motive explains it away. Putting a small sign in a window is not dramatic enough to be explained by pressure or fear or profit. So the mind reaches for the simplest explanation available. I must be the kind of person who cares about this. So when the second, bigger ask arrives, the homeowner is not evaluating it in a vacuum. They are weighing it against a mental model of themselves that already includes the idea, I am the kind of person who helps with this. Saying no to the big sign now requires contradicting that self-image, admitting some inconsistency between who they believe themselves to be and how they are about to act. People find that deeply uncomfortable. Consistency is one of the most powerful, least discussed forces in human decision-making. We do not just want to look consistent to others, we want to feel consistent to ourselves. So the big ask stops feeling like a leap. It feels like a continuation. That is the entire mechanism. No clever wording, no trick of the tongue, just a small action, followed by a shift in self-image, followed by a bigger action that now feels natural. It helps to notice what is absent from this explanation. There is no manipulation of facts, no scarcity trick, no false urgency, none of the pressure tactics that persuasion tends to get associated with in the popular imagination. The homeowner was never lied to. Nobody exaggerated the size of the second sign or hid its true appearance. The entire effect ran on something the person did to themselves, a small inference drawn from their own past behavior, quietly working in the background for 2 weeks before the second researcher ever knocked. Managers use this every week, usually without knowing it has a name, let alone 60 years of research behind it. Take a new hire. On day 1, you do not hand them ownership of a project. That would be the workplace equivalent of asking a stranger for the ugly lawn sign. Instead, you ask them to review one document, give feedback on a slide deck, or proofread a proposal before it goes to a client. It is a small ask. It takes an hour. But something happens in that hour. The new hire starts building a self-image inside this job, inside this team. I am someone who gets asked to review things. I am someone whose opinion gets sought out. A few days later, when you ask that same person to lead a small project, something that would have felt premature in week 1, it lands differently. It feels like the next step, not a leap. The foundation was laid by the tiny request that came before it. Consider how this plays out over the first month of someone's job, because the pattern rarely stops at one small ask. The proofreading favor gets followed by a request to sit in on a client call, just to listen, take notes, nothing more. Then a request to draft the follow-up email after that call. Each of these on its own looks trivial, barely worth mentioning in a one-on-one. But by the end of the month, the new hire has quietly accumulated a string of small yeses, each one reinforcing the same self-image. I am someone who is trusted with real work here. When the actual project lead role opens up, the ask does not feel like a jump from nothing. It feels like the obvious next rung on a ladder they have already been climbing, one small step at a time. Now take a reluctant team, the kind that resists change on principle, not because the idea is bad, but because change itself is exhausting. Walk in and announce a full process overhaul, and you get resistance, sometimes open, sometimes the quieter kind, where people nod and then ignore the new process for months. But ask that same team to pilot one small piece of the change, run it for 2 weeks, just to see what happens, and the ask is small enough that most people agree. Once they have run the pilot and lived inside it, something in their self-image shifts. We are the team that tried the new approach. We are not automatically against change. When the full rollout comes up, it is no longer a cold ask. It is the next step from a group that already, in its own mind, said yes to the general direction. Watch what happens inside that 2-week pilot window, because it is doing more work than it looks like on the surface. The team is not just testing a process. They are quietly rehearsing a new identity, one meeting at a time. Someone mentions in a stand-up that the new approach saved them 20 minutes on a task. Someone else half-jokingly admits it was less painful than expected. None of that is a formal endorsement, but it accumulates the same way the window sign accumulated in that suburban homeowner's mind 2 weeks earlier. By the time the full rollout gets proposed, the team has already told itself, in dozens of small ways, that this is the direction it is heading in anyway. There is a third pattern worth naming. one that shows up constantly in cross-functional work. Say you need buy-in from a stakeholder in another department, someone with no obligation to prioritize your request and every reason to deprioritize it in favor of their own team's goals. Asking cold for a significant chunk of their team's time is a hard sell, but asking for something small first, a short conversation to understand their constraints, a quick read of your proposal before it is finalized, changes the relationship. That stakeholder has now engaged with your project in some small way. Their own sense of themselves shifts slightly toward being invested in the outcome. The larger ask that follows is not landing on a blank slate. It is landing on someone who has already taken one small step down the same road. This is often the difference between a project that limps through approvals and one that moves quickly. A stakeholder who has already given 15 minutes of feedback on an early draft has, in a small way, put their name on the project. They are no longer a neutral outside party being asked for a favor. They are someone who already has a stake, even if that stake is nothing more than a comment they left in a shared document weeks earlier. Managers who understand this instinctively almost never lead with the big ask. They lead with the small one, and let time and self-image do the rest of the persuading. Here is a piece most management advice skips over entirely. The technique fails in one very specific, very common way, and it is worth understanding exactly why. If the first ask is trivial enough that agreeing to it means nothing, it produces nothing. Signing a form nobody reads, clicking a box out of habit, these are not commitments in the psychological sense, because there is no real decision behind them, and no real decision means no shift in self-image. The small ask has to be real enough that saying yes requires the person to notice they said yes. People hear foot in the door and assume smaller is always safer, so they ask for something so tiny it barely exists, then wonder why the bigger ask later gets refused anyway. The size of the first ask is not the point, the realness of it is. This is where a lot of well-intentioned managers quietly sabotage themselves. They read about the technique, decide to try it, and pick something so minimal it does not register as a choice at all. Please acknowledge you received this email. Please attend this optional meeting nobody actually reads the agenda for. None of that asks anything of the recipient's sense of self, so none of it produces the shift the technique depends on. The small ask has to cost the person something, even if that cost is tiny. A few minutes of real attention, a genuine opinion, offered and recorded. Something they would notice if you asked them to explain, later, why they agreed to it in the first place. Timing matters just as much as size. Friedman and Fraser waited 2 weeks between the small sign and the big one, and that gap turned out to matter. Self-image shifts, triggered by a small commitment, are not permanent installations. They fade. Wait too long, months instead of days, and the sense of, I am the kind of person who does this thing, quietly erodes, buried under everything else that happens in someone's work in the meantime. If you get a small yes from a new hire, a reluctant team, or a wary stakeholder, the bigger ask needs to follow soon. While the self-image shift is still fresh, not sitting on a shelf for a quarter waiting for the right moment. Think of the self-image shift the way you would think of a freshly painted surface. Right after the small yes, it is still workable, still capable of taking a second coat cleanly. Leave it too long, and it hardens into whatever the rest of the person's routine has painted over it. A new hire who proofread one document in their first week and then heard nothing about ownership for 3 months has, by then, settled into a different self-image entirely. I am someone who reviews other people's work. That identity is now just as sticky as the one you were trying to build, and it works against you instead of for you. The lesson is not just ask small first. It is ask small first, and then move. Here is the twist most people miss once they think they have mastered the trick. It does not only work on your team, it works on you, constantly, often by people whose job depends on you not noticing. A vendor asks for a short exploratory call, nothing binding, just a few minutes to understand your needs. You say yes, because why not? It costs nothing. A few weeks later, they are asking for a pilot contract, and it feels oddly natural to agree, even though the pilot is a far bigger commitment than the phone call that started it. A consultant asks to sit in on one meeting just to observe, just to understand the team's dynamics. Weeks later, they are proposing a full engagement, and saying no suddenly feels inconsistent with the openness you already showed. Even your own boss can do this to you, not out of malice, but out of habit. A small extra task here, a quick favor there, and eventually those small yeses stack into a workload that would have looked unreasonable if it had been the opening ask. Sales teams are trained on this explicitly, whether or not they ever hear the phrase foot in the door. The free trial, the no-obligation demo, the quick 15-minute call framed as purely informational, all of it exists to produce one small, real yes before the actual sale is ever proposed. None of these opening moves are dishonest on their own. A free trial genuinely is free. A demo genuinely is informational. But each one is also quietly doing the same work the window sign did in 1966, laying down a self-image. I am someone evaluating this seriously, that makes the next, larger ask feel like a natural continuation rather than a cold decision made from scratch. None of this means every small request is manipulation. Most are not. But it is worth developing the habit of noticing when a small yes is functioning as the opening move of a much bigger ask, so you make a real decision about the big one instead of drifting into it because your self-image has already been quietly nudged. The uncomfortable truth is that awareness alone does not fully protect you. Knowing the mechanism exists does not stop your brain from wanting to stay consistent with your own past behavior. The only real defense is pausing before the second ask and evaluating it fresh on its own merits, as if the first small yes had never happened. That pause is a discipline, not a one-time realization, and it is worth practicing deliberately the next time a small favor lands in your inbox from someone who will want something bigger later. A useful habit here is asking a single, deliberately blunt question before agreeing to the second, larger request. Would I say yes to this if the small favor before it had never happened? If the answer is genuinely yes, agree freely. The earlier favor was never doing the persuading. If the honest answer is no, or even a hesitant maybe, that is worth noticing, because it means the earlier yes is the thing carrying the decision, not the merits of what is actually being asked now. So what does this mean for how you actually manage people? Do not pitch the whole change on day one. Do not hand a new hire the keys to a project in their first week. Do not ask a skeptical team to overhaul everything in one meeting. Get a small, genuine commitment first, something real enough to register, and then build the bigger request on top of it within days, not months, while the self-image shift is still doing its quiet work. That is the entire playbook, and it costs nothing but sequencing. A tiny yes today can buy you a bigger yes tomorrow. Whether you are the one asking or the one being asked, that single sentence is worth remembering every time a small, harmless-looking request lands on your desk. It is rarely as small as it looks. If this changed how you will frame your next ask, follow this channel, because the next theory might change how you run your next meeting.